Right now, across a stretch of the country most people haven't even glanced at the forecast for, meteorologists are watching something they don't like the shape of. Not a single storm, not one system you can point to on a map and say, that's the problem. Something wider, something moving, a pattern of severe thunderstorms, flash flooding, and dangerous heat that forecasters at the National Weather Service are now describing, or in their own language, as a threat that continues and is set to expand from the Midwest, across the Mid-Atlantic, and into the Central High Plains. If you live anywhere inside that corridor, you need to understand something before you keep scrolling past this forecast like it's just another rainy week. This isn't isolated. This isn't over. And according to the government's own short-range forecast discussion issued this weekend, this is a very fluid situation. And the word fluid from a federal forecaster is not a word you want to hear when it's followed by the threat for future impacts remains valid. Let's start with what's actually happening on the ground right now, because the picture is bigger than any single headline is capturing. As of this morning, the Weather Prediction Center in College Park, Maryland has severe thunderstorm, heavy rainfall, and flash flooding threats stretching in an unbroken line from the Midwest through the Mid-Atlantic and across the Central High Plains. That is not a small patch of bad weather passing through overnight. That is a threat corridor, spanning multiple states, multiple time zones, and multiple types of danger stacked on top of each other. Wind, water, and heat, all active simultaneously, all being tracked by the same team of forecasters trying to figure out where the worst of it lands next. And here's where it gets worse. Forecasters have already issued a moderate risk of excessive rainfall for portions of West Virginia, and a moderate risk, in the language the Weather Prediction Center actually uses internally, is not their top tier of alarm, but it is close enough to it that when it appears on a map, local emergency managers start paying very close attention. Think about what that actually means for the people living inside that zone. A moderate risk of excessive rainfall isn't a warning about a few puddles on the road. It's a signal that the atmosphere has loaded itself with enough moisture and the right systems are lining up in the right way that flash flooding becomes a real and immediate danger. The kind that can turn a quiet creek into a wall of water in under an hour. The kind that catches drivers on low-lying roads who had no idea the storm behind them was carrying that much rain. And this isn't happening in isolation. Just one state over, forecasters are also watching a slight risk zone forming across east-central Missouri and southern Illinois, where something called an MCV, a mesoscale convective vortex, essentially a spinning pocket of stormy energy left behind by an earlier cluster of thunderstorms, is interacting with a deep pool of atmospheric moisture. The forecasters measuring that moisture aren't using vague language either. They're citing precipitable water values around 25 inches along the inflow axis. Read that again. That's not typical summer humidity. That's the kind of atmospheric loading that turns ordinary thunderstorms into flash flood machines. But the story doesn't stop at rain and wind, because there's a second threat running in parallel across a completely different part of the country, and it's just as dangerous in its own quiet, grinding way. While the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic brace for flooding, the National Weather Service is tracking dangerous heat that is persisting across the south and southeast, and building into the southwest as this week unfolds. This is where the picture stops being about a single bad storm system and starts looking like something closer to a nationwide squeeze, pressure building on two fronts at once, one half of the country dealing with too much water arriving too fast, the other half dealing with heat intense enough that federal forecasters are using the word dangerous in their official short-range discussion. Not uncomfortable, not elevated, dangerous. And this is where everything changes, because heat like that doesn't just make people uncomfortable on a walk outside. It's the kind of heat that turns into emergency room visits, that strains power grids already working overtime to keep air conditioners running, that becomes deadly fastest for the people with the least ability to escape it. The elderly, outdoor workers, anyone without reliable access to air conditioning. Now zoom out further, because there's a reason forecasters keep describing this entire pattern as being driven by a much larger structure sitting over the country right now, an amplifying upper-level weather pattern developing through the middle of this week and into the weekend, with a trough digging in across the eastern half of the continental United States, while a ridge builds across the west. If that sounds abstract, here's what it actually means in plain terms. That eastern trough is essentially a dip in the jet stream, a corridor that pulls cooler air southward and creates the exact kind of atmospheric collision zone where severe storms thrive. Collisions between warm, moisture-loaded air near the surface and cooler air aloft. The recipe that produces damaging winds, hail, and heavy rain event after event, day after day, as long as the pattern holds in place. Meanwhile, that western ridge is doing the opposite job on the other side of the country, trapping heat underneath it, building it day by day, with nowhere for it to escape. This is not chaos. This is a structured atmospheric pattern, and as long as it stays locked in place over the coming days, it will keep generating exactly the two threats forecasters are already warning about: flooding on one side of the country, dangerous heat on the other. Here's where the story widens even further, because severe weather forecasters aren't just tracking today and tomorrow. They're already looking out across the next several days, and what they're seeing doesn't offer much relief. The Storm Prediction Center's extended outlook, covering days 4 through 8, shows continued unsettled weather rotating around the same large upper-level high sitting across the southern tier of the country, with scattered thunderstorms continuing to fire along frontal boundaries draped from the Central High Plains all the way to the Mid-Atlantic. In plain terms, this isn't a system passing through and clearing out by Wednesday. This is a pattern that's expected to hold, shifting its exact location day by day, but keeping the broader threat corridor active well into the coming week. And what most people watching their local weather app don't realize is that these extended outlooks aren't guesses thrown out for entertainment. They're built from ensemble modeling. Dozens of forecast simulations run in parallel, and when multiple models agree on a pattern holding for 5, 6, 7 days out, that's forecasters telling you, as clearly as the science allows, that this isn't going away on its own. And this is exactly where the situation stops being a regional story and starts becoming something with implications for a much wider stretch of the country than most people currently watching the news would expect. Because while all of this unfolds across the central and eastern United States, there's a second, entirely separate threat building, thousands of miles away, and it's already active. The National Hurricane Center is currently issuing advisories on Tropical Storm Lala in the Central Pacific, with the storm's most immediate local impacts centered on Hawaii. This is not a hypothetical system still forming somewhere out in open ocean. This is a named tracked storm, active right now, with the Hurricane Center's local information feed already pointing directly at Honolulu. And here's the detail that should make you pay closer attention rather than less. Earlier forecast analysis from hurricane specialists tracking this system's predecessor disturbance described the potential for a significant storm affecting all of Hawaii, with waves building to 20 feet as the system churned through the Pacific Basin in the days leading up to its formal designation. 20-foot waves, think about what that number actually represents for anyone near the coastline. Not a rough day at the beach, but ocean conditions capable of reshaping shorelines, flooding low-lying coastal roads, and making any kind of water activity outright life-threatening. But here's where the analysis gets more layered and more honest, because not every forecast in this story points toward worsening conditions everywhere at once. And pretending otherwise would be exactly the kind of overstatement that erodes trust the moment reality doesn't match the panic. NOAA's own seasonal outlook, updated as recently as August 6th of this year, maintains its prediction for a below-normal Atlantic hurricane season overall. As of the most recent update, the 2026 Atlantic season has produced exactly 2 named tropical storms, Arthur and Bertha, and notably, 0 hurricanes. Arthur formed in mid-June over the warm waters of the Gulf, bringing record rainfall to portions of Louisiana and spawning tornadoes along the Gulf Coast before Bertha followed a similar path, making landfall in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana. So the Atlantic Basin, contrary to what a purely fear-driven narrative might claim, is not currently overheating into a hyperactive season. What most people are not seeing, because it doesn't fit neatly into a single alarming headline, is that this story has 2 entirely different engines running at the same time. A below-normal, but not inactive Atlantic season that has already produced real, damaging landfalling storms, running in parallel with an active, currently tracked Pacific system bearing down on Hawaii, running in parallel with a domestic severe weather and flash flood pattern gripping the middle of the continental United States. 3 separate threats. 3 separate timelines, all active on the same day. So why does all of this matter together rather than as 3 disconnected local weather stories scattered across different news cycles? Because this is exactly the kind of pattern that stretches emergency response capacity thin in ways that don't show up until it's too late to prepare for them. Consider what's actually being asked of the system, meant to protect people through all of this at once. Federal forecasters at the Weather Prediction Center are tracking flash flood potential across a stretch of states from the plains to the Atlantic coast. The Storm Prediction Center is simultaneously modeling severe thunderstorm potential across nearly the same corridor, days into the future. The National Hurricane Center is issuing live advisories on a tropical system approaching a state sitting 2,000 miles from the mainland. And regional heat warnings are active across the south, southeast, and building into the southwest. All of it on the same day, tracked by overlapping but distinct teams inside the same federal weather infrastructure. This is not a system built to handle one emergency. It is being asked, right now, to track 4 simultaneously across a landmass spanning multiple climate zones and multiple ocean basins. Now think about what that actually means for the people living inside each of these zones, because the consequences aren't abstract. In the flash flood corridor, stretching from the Midwest through the mid-Atlantic, the immediate danger isn't just rainfall totals. It's what those totals do to infrastructure that was never built to absorb them. Roads that flood in under an hour. Low water crossings that look passable right up until the moment a vehicle is swept off them. Basements and low-lying homes in towns that haven't seen flooding like this in years, if ever. In the heat zone building across the south, southeast, and southwest, the danger compounds quietly. Heat-related illness climbing in emergency rooms. Power grids under sustained strain as air conditioning demand spikes across multiple states simultaneously. And the kind of prolonged exposure that turns dangerous only after days of accumulation rather than a single bad afternoon. And in Hawaii, the danger is entirely different in character. Coastal flooding, dangerous surf, and the logistical nightmare of preparing an island chain, thousands of miles from the mainland's supply chains, for a storm that could still shift its track in the days ahead. Here's the part of this story that deserves the most honest framing, because it's also the part most likely to get flattened into either false calm or false panic, depending on which headline you happen to scroll past first. Nobody, not the Weather Prediction Center, not the Storm Prediction Center, not the National Hurricane Center, is claiming certainty about exactly how severe any single piece of this pattern will become before it resolves. The Weather Prediction Center's own language calls this a very fluid situation. The Hurricane Center's own tracking of Lala's predecessor system explicitly noted that whether the worst of that storm would track near or over Hawaii was, in their own words, unknowable at the time, with different forecast models genuinely disagreeing, some keeping the worst of the system south of the islands, others bringing it closer. That's not evasiveness. That's forecasters being honest about the actual limits of what atmospheric modeling can tell you 5, 6, 7 days out. But here's where the tension sits, and where it should sit for anyone paying attention. Uncertainty about exact severity is not the same thing as uncertainty about whether something dangerous is happening. The threat corridor is real. The moderate risk of excessive rainfall in West Virginia is real. The dangerous heat warning is real, issued in exactly those words by federal forecasters. Tropical storm Lala is real, tracked, and named, with active advisories being issued as you read this. The uncertainty lives in the details, the exact path, the exact rainfall totals, the exact peak temperatures, not in whether the danger itself exists. And this is where the deeper pattern underneath all of it becomes impossible to ignore. Because what's unfolding this week isn't really about any one storm system, any one flood risk, any one heat warning. It's about a broader atmospheric structure locking multiple regions of the country into simultaneous, overlapping threats at the exact same time. An upper-level pattern amplifying, a trough digging into the eastern half of the continent while a ridge builds in the west, a tropical system active in the Pacific, while the Atlantic quietly produces its own landfalling storms, despite an overall below-normal seasonal outlook. Weather, at this scale, doesn't move in isolated, tidy news cycles. It moves as connected systems, and the pattern currently gripping large sections of North America and the Central Pacific is exactly the kind of setup meteorologists watch closely. Not because any single piece of it is unprecedented, but because the simultaneous stacking of multiple active threats across multiple regions, sustained over the coming days rather than clearing in 24 hours, is what turns a normal severe weather week into something that tests the limits of how many warnings people can actually absorb and act on at once. So where does this actually go from here? That's the question hanging over every forecast discussion issued in the last 24 hours, and it's a question nobody currently has a fully confident answer to. Will the moderate risk zone in West Virginia hold, shift, or expand further east into more densely populated corridors along the mid-Atlantic? Will the amplifying upper pattern that's driving severe storms through the middle of the country loosen its grip by the weekend? Or will it lock in place and extend the threat window even further, as the Storm Prediction Center's own extended outlook already hints it might? Will Tropical Storm Lala track close enough to Hawaii to bring the kind of significant island-wide impact hurricane specialists flagged as a real possibility in its earlier stages? Or will it stay far enough south to spare the islands the worst of it, the way some of the newer AI-driven forecast models are currently suggesting? And underneath all of it sits the quieter, harder question. What happens if this pattern of simultaneous, overlapping threats isn't an isolated week, but a preview of how weather systems are increasingly going to stack against each other as the season deepens? The forecasters tracking all of this right now don't have those answers yet. Neither do we. What we do know is that the threat is active. It is being described by federal meteorologists in the clearest terms their profession allows, and it is, by their own admission, still expanding.